Hello friends, welcome to yet another session of fault finding and diagnosis of Godrej appliances. Today we would be talking about air conditioners, and the particular fault that we are talking about today is remote is not working. So let's proceed. The customer feedback over here would be that the remote unit is not working, some buttons of the remotes are not working, or maybe the remote cell casing is rusted. Some questions that we ask the customers would be, have you checked the remote properly to understand whether it's a remote problem or the display problem? Have you replaced the battery of the remote and checked? Is there any rust formation in the remote? If there is any rust formation, it can indicate that the battery is leaking and it must have damaged some electronic components inside the remote. And the next question would be, are there any high frequency generating devices or CFL lamps nearby the IDU? Here we educate the customer as to whether any external device which generates some high frequency can interfere with the working of the remote. So we also ask the customer whether we have checked by pressing all the buttons of the remote one by one to see whether some buttons are faulty or some set of buttons are faulty or whether all the buttons are faulty. So based on those questions, we develop a matrix of some possible causes of remote malfunction. That is, one is the battery is weak or it is rusting. The second probable cause could be that the remote LED is defective or there is carbon deposit on the touchpad, that is on the button pads. The third probable cause could be that the PCB, display PCB could be defective. It's not the problem of the remote, but it could be the problem of the display PCB. There is a sensor in the display PCB which receives the signals from the remote that could be faulty. The fourth probable defect could be, it could be due to high frequency generated by some external devices which are situated or which are placed very near to the indoor unit. And the fifth could be the problem because of high humid conditions. Let's look at these probable causes one by one. We have to check each and every of these probable causes, and then we have to see whether the problem is solved by checking all these causes, and the way to do it is shown in the forthcoming slides. For any air conditioner unit, we have to check the input voltages, whether the earthing is good, whether the phase is in the right, and whether the phase earth and phase neutral voltages are the same. All these are preliminary checks which have to be done on any air conditioners. So here we are checking whether the battery is weak or rusted. How do we check the battery is weak or not? We set the multimeter in DC voltage range and we check the voltage of the battery. 1.5 volt battery, if the voltage falls below 1.3 or 1.2, then the battery is considered to be ineffective. Or if there are traces of rust on the terminals which are attached to the battery, that means this rust will not allow the battery to connect to the remote and the remote will not function. For checking the remote control whether it is defective or not, there is a simple way of checking it through the mobile phone camera and also through physical observations. The mobile phone camera can catch infrared rays which are emitted by the remote control. So it is very easy to check whether the remote control is functioning or not by just looking at the LED of the remote control through a mobile phone camera when we press the buttons, because our naked eye cannot see infrared, but the mobile phone camera can catch infrared rays. This is how it looks when we see it through a mobile phone camera. We can see the LED glowing in a light pink color when any button is pressed, which will indicate that when the button is pressed, the remote is emitting infrared rays respective to that button, so that button is okay. So like this, we check each and every button of the remote by pressing all the buttons one by one, and we see whether these infrared rays are emitted or not. This we are seeing through the camera of the mobile phone, of any mobile phone for that matter. And if we are not seeing this LED glowing, then we know that even though we are pressing the buttons, the battery is there, and if we don't see this LED glowing, we know that the batteries are surely dead and we have to change the batteries. Now we check the PCB of the remote control for carbon deposits. The buttons of the remote control of made of carbon, small dots of carbon on the buttons, and these carbons help to develop a contact of circuit when the buttons are pressed on the remote control's PCB. What happens is, through prolonged use, some amount of this carbon comes and deposits on the circuit, and then it will create a sort of a barrier. So when we press the button, that button won't work. So what we have to do is, we have to clean off the carbon deposits on this part of the PCBs, and we can do it by cleaning it with tissue paper, or by dipping some cotton in isopropyl alcohol and then cleaning the contacts thoroughly till the time all the carbon deposits have been removed. Many a times the problem of remote not working can be attributed to the large distance between the remote and the indoor unit. The distance between the remote and the indoor unit should not be so large that it is beyond the range of the remote control. How do we check this? When we stand in front of the indoor unit to a maximum of 7 meters apart, then the remote control should work. Beyond 7 meters, we may not guarantee that the remote control will properly work. And when we stand in front of the indoor unit, and then when we move aside till an angle of 70 degrees from in front of the indoor unit, then the range is lessened to 5 meters, which means when we stand perpendicularly in front of the indoor unit, then the range of the remote control would be a maximum of 7 meters distance between the remote and the indoor unit. But when we move sideways to an angle of less than 70 degrees, then the remote control will work up to 5 meters away from the indoor unit. But beyond 70 degrees, when we try to check, or when we try to operate the remote control, there are many a times it may not work. Then the next defect, if there are any CFL lamps, tube lights, any Wi-Fi or high frequency generating device which are installed just near the indoor unit. We check for CFL lamps. CFL lamps emit some high frequency and they interfere with the working of the remote control, and therefore they have to be removed, or they have to be replaced at a distance which is far enough so as to not interfere with the working of the remote. Wi-Fi units or CFL tubes, they have to be installed at a little distance from the indoor unit so that the interference is not there. Then the final checkup is of the indoor unit PCB or IR sensor on the display unit. For this, you need a multimeter which can easily measure low voltages, DC voltages, that is low DC voltages which can easily and accurately measure DC voltages. We need that kind of a multimeter over here. See, we see the display unit or we see a sensor. There is a black small component on the display unit, on the display PCB. This component has got 3 legs. This component is called the IR sensor, or it's the IR receiver, infrared receiver. This infrared receiver has got 3 legs. So the first 2 legs of the infrared receiver, that is ground and VCC, GND and VCC, it would be written in front of those legs. Between those legs we have to check whether when the machine is on, there is a continuous voltage of 5 volt DC between these 2 terminals, that we have to check. If no, then the main PCB is faulty, because the main PCB is responsible for giving 5 volt DC to the display PCB. If this 5 volt is absent to the display PCB as soon as the machine is started, that means the main PCB, the main IDU PCB is faulty, because that is responsible for giving this 5 volt. Or if the 5 volt is available, then we check for when the remote is pressed, 0 to 5 volts will be available between the other two, V out and the ground terminals, that is from the ground terminals and the third terminal which is V out, which means voltage out. Voltage out, output and the ground, between these 2 terminals we would be getting a variable DC voltage, any DC voltage between 0 to 5 volt DC, depending upon which button of the remote control that we have pressed. For different buttons that we press on the remote control, we will be getting different voltages over here, but all these voltages will be between the range of 0 to 5 volt DC. So we check that if this is available, then the remote is okay. If this variable voltage is not available, that means the remote control is faulty, because it is not giving that variable voltage for the IR sensor to pick up. The IR sensor will pick up the different infrared rays, and based on those infrared rays it will generate different DC voltages. So this is how we check whether the PCB is faulty, that is the display PCB is faulty, or the indoor unit PCB is faulty, or the remote is faulty, through checking on the 3 terminals of the infrared sensor which is mounted on the display PCB of the air conditioner. See, this is the infrared sensor which is shown in the red color. And the various terminals, this is how they are indicated. And lastly, high humid conditions in the ambient, they also interfere with the working of the remote, because humidity means moisture, and moisture interferes with electronic circuits in a big way. Very humid conditions, where there is a foggy condition or something, then it is advisable to use the remote control put inside a plastic cover, or it has to be covered properly, it has to be shrouded properly, it has to be isolated away from the moisture conditions, or otherwise what will happen is the moisture may enter the circuit inside and it can short some short terminals, and it may render the remote control ineffective, or it can spoil the remote control's PCB. So moisture will spoil the remote's PCB, so we have to be very careful. when we are using it in high humid condition. We can check the humidity with the humidity meter. The temperature, we have got this kind of integral temperature and humidity meters which are easily available. We can check the humidity. It should not be more than 65% for proper working of the remote. Otherwise, the remote has to be properly shrouded by putting it inside some plastic cover. So that was all, guys. See you again with yet another fault finding and diagnosis session. And thank you for now, and see you later. Bye.